Live everywhere.
Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning. How are you doing, everybody? It is Friday, January 5th, 2018. I'm in Donald Trump mode. How are you doing, everybody? I'm going to kind of mumble my way through the show. Well, I don't have to do 2 hours of show because I can just repeat myself over and over again. That, of course, is still the big topic of discussion because it's a national emergency. The president is crazy and senile and dotardly and was entirely inadequate to the job and should have been disqualified in the first place. Plus, he's also on the take from Russia. All of this happening before he even moved into office and demonstrated the mental health issues. He never had the capacity to do this job in the first place, of course. And we all know that. I don't need to tell you that. It's just sort of how you got to start the morning because it's true. And many people still discussing it today. Many people are saying that I am completely out of my depth. And that's even that actually probably too sophisticated a phrase to even attribute to him. I guess if you saw it tweeted, you would know that someone else had composed it for him. And I don't know. What else ought we even to discuss today, to be honest? Let's see what Bill has in mind over on Twitter. It's usually, of course, it usually takes its cues from things that I've said I have in mind. So what do I have in mind today? I might as well be asking Bill. Daily Kos Radio is live now. I warn you of this. If you all behave yourselves, KagroX. Hi, that's me. Easy way to reach me on Twitter, by the way, KagroX, and it transfers to Gmail as well. Daily Kos Radio is live. If you all behave yourselves, I might read some more from America's new sacred text, Fire and Fury. Yes. Oh, goody. I might. I probably will. I'll be reading excerpts, of course, because although the book apparently is shipping today, and there's a story behind that, I don't have it yet. And that probably, I'm going to chalk that up to I haven't ordered it. Well, that could be the reason. Of course, it is shipping today. It was originally scheduled, I guess, to go out on Tuesday. I don't know what that means, really, when they say shipping. I think that means it's widely available already when they ship. I don't know whether that's like the release date when you're supposed to be able to go to the bookstore and buy it from off the shelf, or is it literally a ship date? Like if you ordered it from the publisher, or I guess from Amazon, they, I'm sure, by now have the muscle to be able to ship this thing on ship date. Is that the date they'll drop it in the mail to you and you can't get it any earlier? And if you pre-ordered it at a bookstore, it'll be shipped to the bookstore on that date and shortly there. I don't know. I've never waited in line for a brand new book to be distributed or shipped or anything. I don't believe I've ever waited in line for a book of any sort. I've never waited in line on opening night for a movie or for a new iPhone either. I just don't do that sort of thing. Although one time I went to a Black Friday sale once. I had a family member who was visiting for Thanksgiving and staying over and really desperately wanted to go to Target for some reason for a Black Friday sale. And I guess I wanted to see what it would look like. And, of course, I live way out in the suburbs, so it wasn't going to be completely nuts. But I wanted to see, are people really outside the store waiting to go in? And, I waited, and they weren't. I blew it. I think I blew my chance. There were some people out there. They had some lights outside. Very exciting time in my life. I thought I might tell you about that. But instead, everybody's talking about the book, and, of course, the shipping date moved up. It was supposed to go out next Tuesday, and as I understand it, the president has now threatened to sue the publishers trying to block publication of the book. Of course, it's too late, all the best stories, and probably not even the best stories, because I don't think they would give them all away in the excerpting in the magazines, but clearly the good stuff that people wanted to hear about was being teased here. So the cat's out of the bag as far as dotard J. Trump being inadequate to the task. So I don't know what he thinks he's going to do by blocking publication. He could, of course, sue for libel at some point, or he could have if he were a private individual. some question remains about how able he is to do that from the presidency. And I do note that there was some attempt yesterday to separate him from this, from the presidency, from his idiotic action in filing suit. I think, let's see, who was it yesterday? Jim Acosta tweeting at the end of the briefing, the press secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, said Trump's threat to sue over the Wolf book should not be seen, it just shouldn't. It should not be seen as an effort from the U.S. government or the Trump administration to censor a book. It just should be seen as private individual, I guess, Dotard J. Trump saying, I want this not to be published, essentially. And that's not really something that you can do, not only just stop things from being published because they're embarrassing, but to do that from the bully pulpit, as it were, of the presidency. All right, let's see. I got to press some buttons here. For some reason, again, Soundboard has disconnected from my my setup, and I don't know. I think it seems to have played all the music okay. So maybe the setting doesn't matter as much on that. But I thought I would take care of it anyway. Yeah. So that's their line. It shouldn't be seen as an effort from the U.S. government or Trump administration to censor a book, which is convenient because, of course, the guy who's filing suit shouldn't be seen as president. And I think that meshes very nicely. And they simply ought to agree that both things can be true at the same time. But, of course, lots of separation of powers issues, not separation of powers issues, but limitation of powers issues for the president to be the person who's sitting in the presidency suing for any reason to block publication of a book. You've got to have, essentially, if anything is going to work in terms of prior restraint, as they like to call it, there's going to have to be a national security claim. And I would say that the odds are greater than 50-50 that Trump directs his lawyers to try to concoct exactly that kind of excuse. The theory being, as we discussed briefly yesterday, Trump's idea, childlike as it is, of everything, but in particular national security, is just basically, well, if you're embarrassing me, and that makes me look somehow lesser, weaker, in the eyes of others around the world, that affects my ability to make great deals with other countries. And so, therefore, it is a blow to our national security, because the great deals that I was going to make were going to greatly upward rise our national security. I was going to say enhance our national security, but he would not be able to pull that at this point. They're going to put an upward rise to our national security. And now, bad things that happened will get sort of in the way of it'll make trouble for me. I mean, I don't even know what he's capable of pulling vocabulary-wise. I think when he's winging it, he seems pretty good. When he's reading, he makes it clear that he doesn't understand the words he's reading. When he's winging it, his vocabulary is diminished, but he's got some set plays. So he's not quite that bad. But, yeah, I mean, that's what's going on this morning. And he's just essentially looking to, block the sales of the book. But, again, cat's out of the bag. I don't think he understands exactly what he's being told, if he's being told anything. This part of what the book reveals. It may just be that nobody's telling him that there's any sort of conflict or problem with his doing that. But if they are, they're being brushed aside. This is something I used to do all the time. You don't understand. When coming up in real estate in New York, I was constantly threatening to sue the society pages, the gossip columns, Page 6, even though I leaked to Page 6. And it worked for him. But of course, well, Mr. President, you were in a different position then. You weren't in government. You weren't the president of the United States, for one thing. For another thing, nobody cares whether some dumb guy in New York sues or threatens to sue a book publisher in New York. over whether or not he said somebody is a nice piece of ass or whatever. Nobody's going to get in the way of that. There's not going to be an investigation of the motivations behind it. And here we face a totally different set of circumstances. No, nonsense. I'm going golfing. Shut up. You're all fired. So I don't see it changing very much, even if they are telling him the problems with this. Anyway, interesting piece, also widely discussed by James Fallows in The Atlantic, appearing yesterday, but I guess I missed it yesterday, or maybe it happened after the show. And it's entitled, "It's Been an Open Secret All Along. The scandal," he says, "of Michael Wolff's new book isn't its salacious details." I hate the salacious details. Imagine him trying to say, "I hate the salacious details in this book." Somebody has handed him a card that says salacious in it. It's not, though, that the book has salacious details. It's that everyone in Washington has known its key themes and refused to act. And I would remind you, it's more than just being an open secret. It's more than just refusing to act. Writ large, the problems, that is, not just the senility, but, of course, the involvement, the over-involvement of Trump with Russians, Russian money, the Russian government, whether there are intermediaries or whatever. All of that is also an open secret, and also people have refused to act. And I remind you that members of Congress, high-ranking members of the Republican leadership, the Speaker of the House, the third-ranking constitutional officer in the country, involved in that conversation, taped at some point. When did we learn of it? I think I actually have the article handy. May of last year. It was laid bare for everyone to see. A transcript of discussions between the Republican leaders in the House, including the Speaker of the House, who, like I said, is the third-ranking constitutional officer in the country, and the Majority Leader of the House, Kevin McCarthy, and others, openly discussing not only Trump's, well, I guess we'll put it this way, chronologically speaking, in their conversation. They're first discussing the seriousness of the problem of Russian interference in Western elections. First, that it has taken place, provably so, according to the briefings they've all had, both from the victims of that interference, a Ukrainian delegation who told them all about it, but also from law enforcement and intelligence community sources here in the United States. They laid bare the Russian bears' plans and executed plans at that to interfere in Western democratic elections, and that it was worrisome to them, that the Ukrainians had been there to tell them that they ought to worry about it happening elsewhere, including the United States, and that they'd had warnings from the intelligence community that it could happen in the United States, might even be happening in the United States. And from that point, I guess that's where there was the jumping off point at which Kevin McCarthy said, I got to tell you, I think the Russians are paying Trump. And I think it's happening actually to a member of the House here, one of our own Republican members. Was it Dana Rohrabacher that they were talking about, right? And he just blurts that out. And, of course, everyone laughs. Now I think we could pretty well assert that there's nervous laughter. If not entirely nervous laughter, then it was certainly mixed in among the incredulous laughter. And then, of course, Paul Ryan swears them all to secrecy. So there's that going on too. Yeah, sure. He seems so demented and so in the pocket of the Russians that it must be that he's getting paid. And also, P.S., he has no skills whatsoever and is in cognitive decline, and everyone can tell. But let's all swear not to tell anybody, because someone like Paul Ryan was in position to know this meddling in the affairs of Western democracies, true though it may be, it won't be hurting us any as Republicans. It damages our republic because, of course, it renders our governance ineffective, as well as I'm Donald Trump. I'm like fumbling for words. It's illegitimate. And it undermines and calls into question the very legitimacy of the government we've supposedly elected. If they're doing this on a large scale, we agree that they are, but ha ha ha, the end result is Republicans will run the place. It's true we'll be illegitimate, but one, people might not find that out, and two, people having found it out might not know that they can do anything about it or how to go about it, and it will be a couple of years before anybody figures out how illegitimate and what can be done, and in the meantime, we'll be passing laws and cutting taxes and implementing the agenda that a legitimate government of the United States could never have implemented, because there's no way it would have been in unified Republican hands in these numbers, minus the interference. If that's the feeling, let's keep it quiet, because yes, America is under attack, but we're the immediate beneficiaries of that attack. So let's just keep it in the family, shall we? And I'm sure that's largely been the approach on Trump's incapacity for the job as well. Sure, he's an idiot. He knows nothing. He may escalate the chances of war. Some of these wars we want anyway. Some we're not so keen on, perhaps. But maybe the quote-unquote deep state that we hate so much, yada yada, when we're trying to take Trump's side in public, will prevent the worst from happening. And it's always been the theory that the president is surrounded by so many advisors and so many layers of bureaucracy that even a total madman couldn't do too much damage, because there would just be so much red tape to cut through, and they could constrain him. And they weren't necessarily thinking madman who's also incapable of, adult cognition. That wasn't in the picture. I don't think anybody anticipated that. But we got both, the perfect storm, as it were. And it turns out that a moron with the impulsiveness of a toddler and someone who lacks all self-awareness and lacks any capacity or ability for the job or any background in foreign policy, domestic policy, anything, can't simply, the government can't simply continue to function as normal through inertia. You really can do immediate and lasting damage, and no one wants to step up and acknowledge it. So that's part of what's an open secret as well. So anyway, James Fallows organizes his thoughts better in writing than I do on the fly. So let's lean on that as a place to start, and it'll probably take us up to our first break and maybe even beyond. 3 months ago, he writes, when Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey of the New York Times unloaded their first big report about Harvey Weinstein's pattern of sexual aggressiveness and abuse, the depth of detail made the story unforgettable and, as it turned out, historic. Real women went on the record using their real names, giving specific dates and times and circumstances of what Weinstein had said or done to them. Of the reactions that flowed from this and parallel accounts about Roger Ailes and Bill O'Reilly in the Fox Empire, or Matt Lauer and Charlie Rose in mainstream TV, or Kevin Spacey and Louis C.K. in the film world, or Michael Oreskes and John Hockenberry in public radio. Oh my gosh, it goes on and on. Or Mark Halperin and Leon Wieseltier. You know what? I never really knew who he was, to be honest with you, in print and political media. And down the rest of the list, one response was particularly revealing. It was that the behavior in question had been an open secret. Now, a term of art, I guess. In the very short term, a few people reflexively offered open secret as an explanation, even a rationalization. Of course, everybody knew that Harvey, Roger, Kevin was this way, the reasoning went. If you were smart, if you kept your distance, and you'd never take the bait of going for a meeting up in a hotel room, want to give or get a massage, no way. But you rarely hear rationalizations of that sort anymore. Now the open secret premise usually leads to a follow-up question. If everyone, quote unquote, everyone knew what was going on, why didn't anyone do more to stop it? And this, in turn, has led to institutional and personal self-examinations. In the best circumstances, organizations have asked, how could we have failed that badly? What should we do differently? Individuals have asked, what should I have known that I merely suspected or willfully ignored? What more could I have done based on what I actually knew? For powerful illustrations of this last category from members of the Atlantic family involving episodes at the New Republic, see this by Michelle Cottle. There's a link, of course, another piece by Peter Beinart, and another one from Franklin Foer. In the worst circumstances, though, details have piled up about organizations that made deals, payoffs, or threats to keep ugly specifics of what they knew from getting in the way of their business plans. Thus, the tens of millions of dollars in harassment settlements while Bill O'Reilly was still a Fox cash cow. Thus, the payoffs and investigations by the Weinstein Organization to placate or intimidate women who might otherwise go public with their complaints against Harvey Weinstein. In all these cases, the malefactor remains most to blame, but it was an open secret, now properly seems a broadened indictment of all those who quietly let him get away with it rather than an excuse. The details of Michael Wolff's new book, Fire and Fury, make it unforgettable. That's a plug, by the way. You got to pay me for giving you the title. Fire and Fury. Fire and Fury. Fire and Fury. Send a check, please. Anyway, the details make it unforgettable and potentially historic. We'll see how many of them fully stand up and in what particulars, but even at a heavy discount, it's a remarkable tale. But what Wolff is describing is an open secret. Based on the excerpts now available, Fire and Fury, ka-ching, presents a man in the White House who is profoundly ignorant of politics, policy, and anything resembling the substance of perhaps the world's most demanding job, which, by the way, I still think is going to kill him. As physical as next week. He is temperamentally unstable. Most of what he says in public is at odds with provable fact. And once again, we get back to euphemisms for lying. But okay, he's an artist painting here, not necessarily reciting a list of facts. Most of what he says in public is at odds with provable fact from biggest inaugural crowd in history onward. Whether he's aware of it or not, much of what he asserts is a lie. And that's an interesting take on it, too. I've been wondering whether the senility will give people permission to say something, too. If they can't bring themselves to say, that's a lie, he's a liar, then maybe they can say, well, it's not his fault. He's not lying. He's just senile. That might be an escape hatch. We'll see if anybody takes it. His functional vocabulary is markedly smaller than it was 20 years ago. Definitely noticeable here. We've remarked on that in the past. The oldest person ever to begin service in the White House, that's true. He is increasingly prone to repeat anecdotes and phrases. And that's true, too. Yeah, don't forget, don't leave any of this behind, that he's the oldest person ever to assume the presidency, and probably among the heaviest, by the way. And that's not, that's not a disqualifier. It's just health-wise, you're talking about a person not just in cognitive decline, but in physical decline as well. That's just fact. Anyway, where were we with this? Oh, yes, he's the oldest person ever to begin service in the White House. He's increasingly prone to repeat anecdotes and phrases. Haven't I just done that? He is a swirl in foreign and financial complications, which would be too difficult to unravel, perhaps, for someone 20 years younger than him. Him 20 years younger, but okay. He has ignored countless norms of modern governance, from the expectation of financial disclosure to the importance of remaining separate from law enforcement activities. He relies on immediate family members to an unusual degree. He has an exceptionally thin roster of experienced advisors and assistants. His White House staff operations have more in common with an episode of The Apprentice than with any real-world counterpart. He has a shallower reserve of historical or functional information than previous presidents, and a more restricted supply of ongoing information than many citizens. He views all events through the prism of whether they make him look strong and famous, and thus he is laughably susceptible to flattering treatment from the likes of Putin and Xi Jinping, among abroad or couriers at home. I thought that was a particularly interesting turn of phrase, too. And that makes it as simple and childlike as possible. He views all events through the prism of whether they make him look strong and famous. That really hit home for me. And as Wolf emphasizes, everyone around him considers him unfit for the duties of office. From the account that Greg brought to our attention yesterday from the Hollywood Reporter, hoping for the best with their personal futures as well as the country's future depending on it, my indelible impression of talking to them and observing them through much of the first year of his presidency, the people in the White House, is that they all, 100%, came to believe he was incapable of functioning in his job. This is news in its detail. Just as the specifics of Weinstein's marauding were real hard-won news, but it is also an open secret. This is the man who offered himself to the public over the past 2.5 years. And we all watched him do it too. So yes, this will stretch into our second segment, no doubt. But let's continue with it and pick up on it again on our way back out here too. Let me just make sure we have our music in position here. He begins his second section here by saying, I feel this way because I believe I chronicled signs of every one of those traits through the campaign cycle in the Atlantic's 162 installment Trump Time Capsule series. Probably a good thing to go back and look over now in hindsight. But practically anyone else in political journalism can make a similar claim. Who and what Trump is has been an open secret, and he's been the biggest teller of those open secrets himself in his actions and anecdotes and activities that we've all watched. We'll discuss it a little bit more. How about that after this? Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, interrupting this little break to say thanks so much to all of you who are contributing supporters of Kagro in the Morning. Thousands of you are downloading the show each day, but fewer than 1 in 25 regular listeners are donating to help keep us on the air. For the money you'd spend on a single 3-minute iTunes song, we bring you 2 hours of great news and entertainment every day, 5 days a week. Patreon.com, Patreon.com makes it easy. You can find us there by searching KagroX or David Waldman or Kagro in the Morning or even Daily Coast Radio in their search box, and you'll be right where you need to be to make easy, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Once again, thanks so much for your support. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio, which should just basically be the let's complain about Donald Trump and how stupid he is and how he should never have been president show. But not a bad show at that. It's really rather amazing. I wonder, by the way, how many of you intend to actually get this book and read it? I'm not really hugely good at reading books, I guess, basically. Donald and I are very similar in many respects. I'm a billionaire. He says he's a billionaire. I don't read books. I'm not a billionaire, by the way. I don't read books very often. He doesn't read books very often unless they're really, really sexy. I don't know what is his criteria for reading books or whatever. But maybe I should, although I don't know. By the time this is all over, everyone will have read it for me, as is usually the case. I don't tend to watch speeches, read books. I don't tend to become informed in any way. I just do it in bits and pieces. I have difficulty sitting through the schlock of a speech. Similarly, I have difficulty plowing through the schlock of a book, the filler, the crap. I want the highlights, and then let's discuss it. Then I'll go back perhaps and read details and make sure I have the context of it correct before I have that discussion, but I'm a highlights guy. I don't know. And then, things that I need to know inside out, then I'll really pour over details. I mean, I say things like, I don't read books, but then I do things like say, I'm going to read a 300-page research paper on, the evolution of the filibuster rule, because I need that level of detail in order to understand, how properly to attack it when the time comes, and which parts of it need preservation and which parts of it need erasure. But in my initial read through on, pop culture events, stuff like this, I tend not to dive in. And I include most political speeches as pop culture events, really. They don't tend to make news beyond the fact that a famous person whom you're supposed to take seriously and who may have the ability to implement these things as policy has uttered them. But they're available for reading afterwards if you need to know, and very, very frequently available for reading beforehand, which I guess is also part of the reason why I don't put much stock in the event itself as news. But okay. Reading a book, not likely to do it, but so many people are tweeting around excerpts of it, and including, I guess, people who have gotten advance copies, who are then highlighting the relevant passages, photographing it with their smartphones, and tweeting it that way, and including one or two excerpts that I saw yesterday that are going to bring us way back in our own arc of coverage of Dotard J. Trump in the past year or two. And you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Maybe you even saw me retweeting it yesterday, and you're salivating at the possibility of hearing the issue brought up again. But first, James Fallows, who I said was a lot more organized in his thinking because he did it in writing and had an editor, and people helped him, and they published it. Let's lean on it where it's been done right. Remember, before the break, we were talking about the fact that he felt that this open secret thing was widely recognized. He had the experience of covering Trump throughout the election in the Trump Time Capsule series for The Atlantic, and he knows he's seen it up close and personal, and he's pretty sure that anybody who covered Trump during the campaign professionally would be able to tell you the same story, probably because it's impossible to avoid. Now, he continues by saying it was because of this open secret that nearly 11 million more Americans voted against Trump last year than for him, including the 3 million more who voted for Hillary Clinton. The rest were people who voted either for Gary Johnson, who got nearly 4.5 million votes, Jill Stein, who got nearly 1.5 million votes, Evan McMullin got about 700,000, and then there were 1 million plus write-in votes. And that's a good point. Just want to reemphasize it. 11 million more Americans voted against Trump than for him. And I would guess that probably nearly every single one of those 11 million, particularly many of those who cast votes for the minor candidates here, did so because they knew that Donald Trump, they knew this open secret, that he was inadequate to the task, and possibly that he was already slipping into dementia, senility, and that even if he weren't, if he were able to implement his so-called policy agenda, it would be a disaster for everyone. And yet, for some reason, they couldn't bring themselves to vote for Hillary Clinton. And let's reserve the value judgment for another time, and there are plenty of times to do that, just so we can move on with this article. But yeah, we all know what you could, should, would like to perhaps say to people who cast protest votes, or what you would like to call protest votes. But you'll have to get your own show to do that, because I need to tell you more about what James Fallows says. It was because of this open secret that virtually every journalistic endorsement in the country went against Donald Trump, including publications like the Dallas Morning News or the Arizona Republic that are ordinarily rock-ribbed Republican, and others like USA Today that had not offered endorsements before. Too milquetoast to have to do that, but they were willing to say, this guy can't be president. He's terrible. Or publications like The Atlantic, which generally did so only once per century. It was because of this that his party's previous nominee, Mitt Romney, now maybe running for Senate in Utah, as you know, publicly denounced him. And that most of the political establishment, Democratic and Republican alike, assumed that no person like him could ever reach the White House. Now, he adds parenthetically, this shared certainty that Trump would fall short which Wolf demonstrates extended to every part of the Trump campaign as well, may explain one of the major journalistic failures of the campaign, the disproportionate harping on Hillary Clinton's email quote problems, as if this objectively third-tier failing were on a par with Trump's grossly disqualifying traits. Most of the press assumed she would soon be in office. This was a warm-up for the kind of inspection real presidents should be prepared to undergo. And I agree with that assessment, even if I can't lay it entirely at the feet of that assessment. But anyway, who is also in on this open secret is his next question. Virtually everyone in a position to do something about it, which at the moment means members of the Republican majority in Congress. They know what is wrong with Donald Trump. They know why it's dangerous. Some of them really don't, but most of them do. They understand, or most of them do, the damage he can do to a system of governance that relies to a surprising degree on norms rather than rules, and whose vulnerability has been newly exposed. They know, or should know, about the ways Trump's vanities and avarice are harming America's interests relative to competitors like China or Russia, and partners and allies in North America, Europe, and the Pacific. They know they could do something. Hearings, investigations, demands for financial or health documents, subpoenas. Even the tool they used against the 42nd president for failings 1% as grave as those of the 45th, impeachment. They know they could act, and they don't. The failure of responsibility starts with Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan, but it doesn't end with them. Every member of a block voting majority shares responsibility for not acting on their version of the open secret. Independent Republicans like Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski share it. Thoughtful ones, these are all enclosed in quotes here, thoughtful ones like Ben Sass and Jeff Flake. Those, in addition to Flake, who have nothing to lose electorally, from Bob Corker to Orrin Hatch. When they vote as a majority against strong investigations, against subpoenas, against requirements for financial disclosure, and most of all, against protecting Robert Mueller and his investigation, they share complicity in the open secret. We are watching the political equivalent of the Weinstein board paying off the objects of his abuse. We are watching Fox pay out its tens of millions to O'Reilly's victims, but we're watching it in real time with the secret shared worldwide and the stakes immeasurably higher. And that's just true. That's where we are. I thought I might share it with you just to set the mood for the day. But yeah, that's kind of where we are. All right, let's round up other news. Let's take in some comments that we've had in the past couple of minutes. Let's see, Mad Hatter is listening along again, asking, how many rats flee the White House in the next 30 days? Most of the people who have persevered through to this point, or who are openly floating the possibility of returning to the White House, like Anthony Scaramucci, I think it's they're sunk regardless. I don't think there's any saving yourself, but there will certainly be attempts at doing it. How many will flee in the next 30 days, I can't tell you. But the place where the rats are most obviously fleeing is actually over in Congress. The Republican members who are refusing to run for re-election, who are retiring. I need to spend more time with my family. Either are afraid of being called out as complicit, or just sick and tired of having to put up with this nonsense and to run interference for the dotardly idiot who occupies the White House. They got what they came for, and they're not interested in spending any more time offering up defenses and casting the embarrassing votes that it takes to protect this guy. Let's see, another comment from Mad Hatter. Might buy it, the book, that is, to drive sales numbers, drive Trump's blood pressure up. That is a good point. And that will work. and it will drive him crazy, and he'll be anger tweeting. And he was doing a little anger tweeting last night. I haven't checked in on him this morning. As time has gone on, by the way, I've done less and less checking on what Trump is actually tweeting. I don't follow him on Twitter. Again, one of those things. I don't bother to follow it myself. I think the best/worst of Trump, and a few other people, by the way, who I don't regard the same way as Trump at all, but who are exhausting to follow. I find the best of the stuff bubbles up through the rest of you who either do follow them or follow someone who follows them, and the best stuff gets retweeted, and it eventually is retweeted into my timeline. I'm sure there are some nuggets that I miss here and there. Trump I don't miss. But for instance, just by way of example of people who I do not regard at all in any way, shape, or form as being anything like Donald Trump, but who I do likewise consider it exhausting to follow, but whose input I actually value for its substance, not to make fun of, though sometimes I make fun of it anyway, would include Matt Iglesias. He would really be thrilled to know he was in the same box, essentially, as Donald Trump. I find it exhausting to follow him because he, like this show, like this feed, touches on so many different subjects and throws out so many more really interesting pieces that require some thinking, some deep thought about what does it mean and what kind of reaction is it drawing out of me. You don't get much done if you follow everything that he has to say and follow up on everything that he has to say. So I prefer to have the system sort of select the best of for me by saying, all right, anybody that I've made a part of my core following list pretty much, or who chimes in frequently despite my list, I trust them to basically be able to sort out the wheat from the chaff. The best stuff that Iglesias has to say gets to me that way. That's my filter for him. But as far as Donald Trump goes, part of it is I just actually don't want to add a follower to his number because I know he measures his success that way. So I think you have a good point, and it would help if it helps sales numbers. Then it might drive him crazy. I'd be happy to add to that anxiety, as it were. All right, let's see. I had mentioned earlier in the show that yes, maybe it could actually help that we now have a permission structure to say he's not lying. Donald Trump isn't lying. He's just senile. Culture of Truth is who I was responding to, by the way. Bob will speak on Twitter with that comment, and he now responds, but the media is not allowed to speculate on a politician's mental health either. Generally speaking, that's true. I'm hoping that has changed now and that there's now a permission structure in place for that. I think there's a lot more work to do on it, but I think it's beginning to change. Another thing which caught my attention this morning, and I put aside to consider this tweet. Let's see. Where does this start? It's Ken Vogel from the New York Times tweeting the following over the course of the last day or so, and continuing into today. Scoop, which we heard about yesterday, the Mercers' split from Steve Bannon was so complete and so bitter that they cut off funding for Bannon's private security detail. More juicy details what does that mean? TK, as we update our story. More juicy details it can't be to come because that's C, unless there's some sort of weird code out there. Okay, TK. Well, maybe somebody knows what he's talking about. That's interesting. I didn't realize how deep the split went, or rather, I guess I should say, I didn't realize how deep the commitment to Bannon went prior to the split. Personal security detail. That's a new bit for me. That was 15 hours ago, along with the link to his piece in the Times yesterday, which I can't recall whether that was one of the ones Greg shared with us or not. Maybe I'll take a glance at that one. Second tweet, though, 13 hours ago, Rebecca Mercer privately blamed Bannon for her father being forced from the helm of the $50 billion Renaissance Technologies hedge fund. How about that? Which was facing pressure from institutional investors upset with the Mercers' funding of Bannon and Breitbart News. And Trump. I mean, that was a backlash over Trump. But, Bannon and Breitbart News, too, I'm sure were used as cudgels in that. That's interesting that she cares, interestingly enough. And I guess that tells us something about his departure. That I don't know if anybody really thought it was a willing departure, but I think they tried to keep up appearances and make it look that way. Clearly it was not. Now, the tweet that caught my eye this morning is actually from yesterday evening, I guess, 8:40 last evening, but being retweeted now. With friends like these, it starts, back when the Mercers were supporting Ted Cruz, and you remember that was the case. Does everybody remember that was the case? They switched from Ted Cruz to Trump at some point, but they were the ones who were more or less secretly bankrolling the Ted Cruz campaign. And you'll remember, if you've been listening since forever, we read a report about how Cruz was operating with, you remember he had two identically named super PACs out there, and they just designated them as 1 and 2. I can't remember what the name, some hopelessly generic name, Renewing America for whatever, but that he named them 1 and 2. They were just basically super PACs that the Mercers had set up, and why they had 2, I can't recall off the top of my head, but it had something to do with the fact that they were pouring so much money into this thing that they were actually overflowing into a second identically named account. Anyway, that's the bottom line of it. The Mercers were supporting Ted Cruz. Back when they were doing that, a group they funded, which Bannon co-founded, because they, again, underwrote everything he did in politics. Anything he was able to make look like a success in newspaper and media profiling of him had been paid for by the Mercers. Anyway, so let's see. While they were supporting Ted Cruz, a group they funded, which Bannon co-founded, compiled and shopped a research dossier on Trump's ties to organized crime in Russia and elsewhere. There's another dossier out there. And, well, it's probably the same dossier we've essentially assembled from news reports over the past 2 years on this show. So I doubt there's very much news in it for us, but the news here is they were preparing the same damn thing, and then, of course, they switched sides, won the election, quote-unquote, won the election, and have spent every moment since we discovered the existence of the other dossier about Trump, insisting that all dossiers about Trump are horrible, horrible lies, and the people who prepared them ought to be killed. Unless, of course, the people who prepared them are us, in which case, something else. Poof, look over there. Don't look at the guy behind the curtain. All right. There's more. About 2 minutes ago, apparently, he was tweeting again, or 2 minutes ago when I set this aside, which means an hour ago when I started with this, the grandiosity of Bannon's plans. And I guess here is the grandiosity. Intended to launch a 501c4 called Citizens of the American Republic that would raise $25 to $30 million to primary GOP incumbents. And you have some idea of what that means from having watched the Alabama race. But $10 million was going to come from the Mercers, and Bannon had failed to win over other mega donors. So I guess that's falling apart. Very interesting. Is there more about it from Vogel himself? Well, of course, there's an article. Is this the same one as he was linking to yesterday or not? Let's see. The headline of today's is, led by the Mercers, Bannon's allies abandon him. Is that the same one we've been talking about the whole time? Yeah. So I guess he's just continuing to promote the same piece. And we did discuss about, his being abandoned by his allies, but I can't recall whether this was the piece we read or discussed about it yesterday with Greg. But I'll put it aside. Maybe I'll give it a quick scan during the break and see whether this needs either to be revisited for any reason, if we did read it yesterday, or needs to be introduced into the record on its own. All right, let's see. Other things that I feel like we need to enter onto the record here. Yes. Again, we won't spend time reading this one per se, but I did mention to you the story in The Intercept about James Risen, or written by James Risen, essentially describing the difficulties that he had having unearthed the warrantless wiretapping stories about the George W. Bush administration in 2004 and fighting with the editorial board at the New York Times, which was being prevailed upon by the White House at the time not to publish those stories, and the big fight about what to do about it. And then, of course, subsequently, the cases brought by the claims made by the government afterwards that Risen was endangering national security by having published. And remember that eventually, I think the outcome in that whole saga, at least the question of the publication of the story was, yes, the New York Times agreed to spike the story until after the 2004 elections, which is an amazing thing all by itself. But they also essentially seemed to want to delay or spike publication of the story even after the election. And it wasn't until Risen began to threaten, prior to the election, he began to threaten that, or relay the threat from someone else, that his sources for this information, for this story, wanted the story out. And they brought it to the New York Times because the New York Times was considered the paper of record. But if the New York Times wasn't going to publish this thing, they might very well share their information with a rival publication just to make sure that it came to light, because it was supposed to come to light. They wanted it to come to light. They thought it needed to come to light. Risen relaying this to the editorial folks at the New York Times in retelling his story now realizes that was actually the last nail in the coffin of the story prior to the election. That actually convinced the editorial staff of the New York Times that the sources had some sort of ulterior political motive, and that they were now threatening the New York Times. Well, that just, I'll show you, we're definitely not going to print the story now. Now, later on, after the election, at some point, Risen basically said, all right, well, we've waited past the election as the administration demanded. Now there's very little excuse, and he added his own demands to the story and saying, I'll publish a book to get this story out. And it began a mini trend of newspaper reporters having to publish their juiciest stuff in book form, and only the impending publication in book form, in the case at least of this story, eventually pushes the New York Times to say, all right, we'll give some attention to perhaps the biggest story of unconstitutional and extra-constitutional activity by an American president in decades, because you're going to publish it next week, and we want to steal your thunder and make it look like the New York Times had the story first. And you did, you just refused to print it. Anyway, that, as I said, is a very long piece, but one apparently very well worth reading, because I haven't gotten through it yet myself. Too much other stuff to do. But Armando will take his word for it. Remember the piece in The Intercept, My Life as a New York Times Reporter in the Shadow of the War on Terror. Companion piece, if you're a fan of Marcy Wheeler's, Empty Wheel has this at her blog, Why I Left The Intercept, the surveillance story they let go untold for 15 months. That's pretty interesting. Just as a side story, right? Lots of people pointing to the Intercept story and James Risen's writing it there. How amazing is it that James Risen, who used to be at the New York Times, now has to tell his story at the Intercept because of the problematic approach the editorial staff of the New York Times takes to blockbuster stories and kowtowing to administrations and letting the news, fit to print as it is, languish and wither on the vine, and you have to go elsewhere to publish the hard stuff these days. And I'm sure, I got no evidence of this, and I'm certain that they're doing it in moderation because they're good people. Over at The Intercept, I'm sure they're very proud of being the place where James Risen could actually tell his story. I wondered whether what Marcy might be going at here is saying, well, don't hurt yourself patting yourself on the back for running the story that the New York Times was afraid to tell about surveillance, because there's another one that you were afraid to run too. I'm very curious about that and how long it will take to get through it. And sometimes, though, if you haven't been following Marcy day by day and sometimes hour by hour, you can get lost in the details of what she's spilling out here and miss something. But I thought I might peek in on this piece and give you a flavor for it and instruct you to read it off the air. Perhaps why I left The Intercept, the surveillance story they let go untold for 15 months, chronicled here. The Intercept now has a long, must-read story from James Risen about the government's targeting of him for his reporting on the war on terror. It's self-serving in many ways. There are parts of his telling of the Wen Ho Lee, the Valerie Plame, and the Jeffrey Sterling stories that he leaves out, which I may return to, but it provides a critical narrative of DOJ's pursuit of him. He describes how DOJ tracked even his financial transactions with his kids, which, she says, I wrote about here, and links to it, and excerpts from it. And, part of the story that we didn't even yet discuss was the pursuit of James Risen personally by George W. Bush and subsequent administrations for, exercising the old First Amendment rights there. And, embarrassing story. And one, like I said, I'm sure that The Intercept relished in telling. But let's pause for our 1-minute break at the top of the hour here and see what we can suss out from Empty Wheels telling of her own story of frustration, this time, I guess, at the hands of the editorial staff of The Intercept. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. I'd like to remind you that you're listening to Netroots Radio. Why not? I feel it's important. And by the way, as often as I apparently beg you for money, especially in the live show, I keep forgetting to get around to recording a commercial, as it were, for our third break, so that we're not repeating the beg for money necessarily in the first and third breaks, if that's still going on. But I don't have any other material to put there, so we might as well use that. Yeah, money is important. We have to admit that. But I wanted to record something that reminds you how you can contribute to the show with your own stories or stories that you think are important, your own commentary as well. And let's get that on the record and available for everybody to remind everybody how you can help out with the show beyond the financial. But anyway, it's I'm sort of skimming around at the same time here, trying to figure out whether or not yesterday's stories from Greg included this New York Times piece or not. I mean, he definitely rounded up every one of the stories on the book and the Bannon split with the Mercers. But yeah, maybe we missed this one. Maybe it wasn't published until after the show. Is there a time on it? No, just the date. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Plus, I forgot the thought I had been prompted with the reminder. Oh, yes, I wanted to remind you also. The reason I remind you every time that we're listening to Netroots Radio is to remind you that in addition to financial support for the Kagro in the Morning Show, it might be nice, and it's still possible to do. And if you go over to Netroots Radio, to their website, and you can find them at, are they, I always, now that I bring it up, are they .com or are they .org? Or are they both? Let's see, netrootsradio.com. Smart enough, of course, to have bought that. But anyway, when you visit their site, which you may not do necessarily each day, even though you listen to them each day, do take a look over there, because the opportunity to help support them financially is available to you as well. And it's more than just the Kagro in the Morning Show that they bring you. Lots of members of the Daily Coast community and the wider Netroots at large are broadcasting their own programs through Netroots Radio, and it costs some money to do that, just as it costs some money to do this. and they have bigger equipment and more expensive stuff than I do. So when you're feeling generous, if you have reason to want to distribute the largesse of your billions the way Donald Trump so frequently claims to be doing, well, Netroots Radio might not be a bad stop for you too. Just thought I'd throw that one out there. Okay, let's see. Armando is sending messages and then sending messages about the messages. Do I want to discuss Mueller and the New York Times article? I read it and thought about it a lot. Sure, I absolutely do. I think I probably would like to get around to it. It would be better if I had digested it beforehand. Let's open the door for that. I'm going to read a little bit more from Empty Wheel here, just to get the flavor of what happened to her over at The Intercept, and maybe in a couple minutes we'll shift gears again and talk about Mueller, and Armando always a good companion for that discussion, and most others. Let's see. Empty Wheel had been saying there's the description of how Risen had been tracked even in his financial transactions, and her writing about it, which included this excerpt. The government eventually disclosed that they had not subpoenaed that would be Risen's phone records, but had subpoenaed the records of people with whom I was in contact. I guess this excerpt is actually from Risen's writing, about which she had described the background at some point in a separate post. The government obtained my credit reports along with my credit card and bank records and hotel and flight records from my travel. They also monitored my financial transactions with my children, including cash I wired to one of my sons while he was studying in Europe. They may or may not have had a legitimate excuse for looking into that one, but probably not. But basically describing some serious lack of respect for the independent and free press here. Anyway, he also reveals that DOJ sent him a letter suggesting he might be the subject of an investigation into Stellar Wind, one of the surveillance programs about which he wrote. An excerpt, it reads here, but in August 2007, I found out that the government hadn't forgotten about me. Penny called to tell me that a FedEx envelope had arrived from the Justice Department. It was a letter saying the DOJ was conducting a criminal investigation into, quote, the unauthorized disclosure of classified information in the State of War, the book that he had written. The letter, which he had to write rather than publish in the New York Times, what we were talking about. The letter was apparently sent to satisfy the requirements of the Justice Department's internal guidelines that lay out how prosecutors should proceed before issuing subpoenas to journalists to testify in criminal cases. Then a brief snip here, and continuing with further excerpting from Risen. When my lawyers called the Justice Department about the letter I had received, prosecutors refused to assure them that I was not a subject of the investigation. That was bad news. If you were considered a subject rather than simply a witness, it meant the government hadn't ruled out prosecuting me for publishing classified information or other alleged offenses. But Marcy continues, a key part of the story lays out the New York Times' refusal to report Risen's Merlin story, another of the surveillance programs, and its reluctance until Risen threatened to scoop him with his book to publish the Stellar Wind one. Glenn Greenwald, hooray, is rightly touting the piece, suggesting that the New York Times was corrupt for acceding to the government's wishes to hold the Stellar Wind story. That's about what you would expect from Glenn Greenwald, and he might even be correct there. But in doing so, he suggests that The Intercept would never do the same. That's apparently not correct. One of the two reasons I left The Intercept, Marcy says, is because John Cook did not want to publish a story I had written. It was drafted in the content management system about how the government uses Section 702 to track cyber attacks. Given that The Intercept thinks such stories are newsworthy, I'm breaking my silence now to explain why I left The Intercept. I was recruited, Marcy writes, to work with First Look before it was publicly announced. Remember, that's the early predecessor to what has become The Intercept here. The initial discussions pertained to a full-time job with a generous salary, which, believe me, Marcy has been pursuing in blogging for the longest time. and it seems rather elusive for all of us, to be honest. But along the way, after Glenn and Jeremy Scahill had already gotten a number of other people hired, and as Pierre Omidyar started hearing from friends that the effort was out of control, the outlet decided that they were going to go in a different direction. They'd have journalists, Glenn and Jeremy counted as that, and they'd have bloggers who would get paid less. I wonder if the woman about whom we're reading was exactly that first person to end up getting paid less. At that point, the discussion of hiring me turned into a discussion of a temporary part-time hire. I should have balked at that point. What distinguishes my reporting from other journalists, that I'm document rather than source-focused, though by no means exclusively, to say nothing of the fact that I was the only journalist who had read both the released Snowden documents and the official government releases, should have been an asset to The Intercept. But I wanted to work on the Snowden documents, and so I agreed to those terms. There were a lot of other reasons why at that chaotic time working at The Intercept was a pain in the ass, as she says, but nevertheless, I set out to write stories I knew the Snowden documents would support. The most important one, I believed, was to document how the government was using upstream Section 702 for cybersecurity. That will make sense only to a small portion of you here, not including myself, necessarily. Something it had admitted in its very first releases, but something that it tried to hide as time went on. With Ryan Gallagher's help, I soon had the proof of that. The initial hook I wanted to use for the story was how, in testimony to PCLOB, I'm stuck right there. Government officials misleadingly suggested it only used upstream to collect things like email addresses. And here a quote from Bob Litt here. When the target selectors such as telephone numbers or email addresses that will produce foreign intelligence falling within the scope of we then target selectors such as telephone numbers and email addresses that will produce foreign intelligence falling within the scope of the certifications. Excerpt. It is targeted collection based on selections such as telephone number and email addresses where there's reason to believe that the selector is relevant to a foreign intelligence purpose. And it is also, however, selector-based, i.e. based on particular phone numbers. Essentially, 3 different examples from documentations in which Bob Litt is explaining that this upstream, this 702 program was only collecting information when they had specific targetable telephone numbers or email addresses. It wasn't a generalized collection. There's another set of excerpts from other, I presume, government officials making the same claims. That PCLOB's witnesses so carefully obscured the fact that 702 is used to collect cybersecurity and other IP-based or other code collection is important for several reasons. First, because collection on a chat room or an encryption key rather than an email thread has very different First Amendment implications than collecting on the email of a target. But particularly within the cybersecurity function, identifying foreignness is going to be far more difficult to do because cyber attacks virtually, by definition, obscure their location, and you risk collecting on victims, whether they are hijacked websites or emails or actual theft victims, as well as the perpetrator. So lots of over-collection and over-inclusion problems in the 702 program, which she's exposing in her writing. Just by way of background, this is what you were missing out on if you got your information solely, let's say, from The Intercept. Moreover, the distinction was particularly critical because most of the privacy community did not know, and many still don't, how NSA interpreted the word facility, and therefore was missing this entire privacy-impacting aspect of the program, though Jamil Jaffer did raise the collection on IP addresses in this hearing that she's referring to. I had, before writing up the piece, done the same kind of iterative work that I always do. The last of these, and there are 3 links provided, would have been a worthy story for The Intercept and did get covered elsewhere. That meant I had put in close to 25 hours working on the hearing before I did other work tied to the story at The Intercept. I wrote up the story and started talking to John Cook, who had only recently been brought in, about publishing it. He told me that the use of 702 with cyber sounded like a good application. It is. So why would we want to expose it? Oh, that sounds different. I laid out why it would be questionably legal under the 2011 John Bates opinion, but in any case would have had very different privacy implications than the terrorism function that the government liked to harp on. In the end, Cook softened his stance against spiking the story. He told me to keep reporting on it. But in the same conversation, I told him I was no longer willing to work in a part-time capacity for the outlet because it meant The Intercept benefited from the iterative work that was as much a part of my method as meetings with sources that reveal no big scoop. I told him I was no longer willing to work for The Intercept for free, which is essentially what was going on. I don't see why she should be. Cook's response was that to exclude me from the first meeting at which all Intercept reporters would be meeting. I guess that's there's a gratuitous two in there, but Cook's response basically cut her out of the whole place. These two things together, the refusal to pay me for work and expertise that would be critical to Intercept stories, as well as the reluctance to report what was an important surveillance story, not to mention Cook's apparent opinion that I was not a worthy journalist, that would be good reason enough to leave, are why I left. And so, in addition to losing the person who could report on both the substance and the policy of the spying that was so central to the Snowden archives, the story didn't get told until 15 months later by two journalists with whom I had previously discussed 702's cybersecurity function, specifically with regards to the Snowden archive. In the interim period, the government got approval for the Tor exception, which I remain the only reporter to have covered, an application that might have been scrutinized more closely had the privacy community been discussing the privacy implications of collecting location-obscured data in the interim. As recently as November, The Intercept asked me questions about how 702 is actually implemented because I am, after all, the expert. I have this feeling come to me every once in a while as well. So by all means, read The Intercept story about how the New York Times refused to report on certain stories, but know that The Intercept has not always been above such things itself. In 2014, it was reluctant to publish a story the New York Times thought was newsworthy by the time they got around to publishing it 15 months later. A legitimate grievance, to be sure, and probably one that happens at every publication. And just, in case there were any big believers that The Intercept was going to be totally different from any other news organization, if it sets itself up as a journalistic organization, it's going to run into the same problems. Editors are going to decide whether or not to use certain stories for political reasons, internal as well as external. And office politics is going to play a part in it as well. And they'll attempt to get stories out of people for less than they should be paying them and possibly zero whenever they can make it work. So a familiar story, to say the least. No, The Intercept isn't the second coming of the founding fathers or anything like that. I doubt very much whether anybody in the audience, even those of you who are still Glenn Greenwald fans, ever really truly believe that about The Intercept or anything else that he's involved in. I think you probably know he and others around him are human as well. But just don't forget that. Good reminder from Marcy. All right, let's say we open things up to Armando. And if you're listening live and interested in outraged on Marcy's behalf, you'll know that we're ready for you here. And let's see if we can make sure that he gets the message. Of course, I just wanted to type him a quick message, letting him know to come on by. But my laptop is slowing down here. I'm going to have to spend a weekend rehabbing it here, so this is quick and easy to do. There we go. There are the melodious chimes, which, by the way, at least one listener is prevailing upon me to check the preferences and see if I can't actually change that notification music because it scares the cats. So we'll have to see whether or not that's easy to do. Good morning, Armando. How you doing?
Hey, good morning.
What's it like there in blizzard struck? Yeah,
it's freezing. It's
really
in the
is.
single digits. It's unbelievably cold.
They canceled school today. Didn't want the kids out at the bus stops. It's below zero wind chills. So, yep.
It's way cold, but I wanted to call in just because I thought this New York Times story was interesting in a way that I don't think people have paid as much attention to.
Okay.
I don't know if you got a chance to read it.
Which one is it that we're talking about?
It's the Michael Schmidt story about. It has a lot of detail about the shenanigans in the White House around the recusal of Sessions, what Trump telling McGahn.
I haven't seen this one.
Pardon me?
I have not yet seen this one, but I did see that his name was on another, his regular beat piece yesterday. So let me see if I can't bring it up so I have it to
you
follow
may want
along
to take
with
a look at it. I think it's an important story.
Okay.
As much for what it doesn't report, because it can't. And I tried to make this point on Twitter last night, which is Schmidt clearly and the New York Times clearly have a lot of good sources within the White House and within the Trump administration itself. But I think that what has gone unnoted, it's been noteworthy now for the 7 months that the Mueller investigation has been going on. They don't leak.
Yeah.
If you're old enough to remember the Ken Starr investigation, not only did we see leaks every other day from the Ken Starr team, his press spokesman had to be fired because he got caught out leaking.
Yeah.
And that, that's grand jury testimony. As you know, grand jury testimony is, and grand jury evidence is, for the prosecutor, confidential. They can't disclose it. Right. They can't talk about it, et cetera. It is by penalty of criminal law. If anybody does, there's something to be done. Of course, nobody got prosecuted on it, but the guy did lose his job. I forget what his name was, Charles something or other. But that's not happening with Mueller. And if you get a chance and you read that story, David, it's a good piece by Schmidt, and in a couple of ways. It's good because the New York Times is good at gathering information, and I don't. Whenever I criticize the New York Times, I think people should understand. I don't question their ability to gather information. They have the influence to get people to talk to them. They're the paper of record and all the things we said the other day. Mm-hmm. My criticism has always been the presentation of the stories.
Okay.
The classic story being the year-ender by Peter Baker,
right,
about how Trump is transforming and reinventing the presidency and how authentic he is and how he's reversed decades of aloofness by presidents. Silly. First of all, that's not reporting those adjectives. That's editorializing, and beyond that, it's stupid editorializing because
lives in a golden palace on Fifth Avenue, but
all that kind of thing.
Right.
So the fact that the New York Times is good at gathering information, I don't think should be questioned. What was good about this story from the Trump perspective, of covering Trump perspective, is I thought it contextually presented the information in a way that really tells the whole story. You and I have talked about frames and permission slips in the last few days. And if you look at that story, in my view, you see a marked improvement on what the New York Times normally does. The Mike Hamerman story approach has failed when covering Donald Trump. Perhaps it would be considered a shift from how they were covering it before.
The Schmidt piece? You mean this particular Schmidt?
Yeah, Michael Schmidt, this particular story. Schmidt has, Schmidt's an investigative reporter. When he's doing investigative reporting, he's, even when his presentations are generally pretty good, because investigative stories often tell, the larger implications sort of are self-evident. When you cover Trump, it's not the case. That's the one thing. There's been a whole argument this morning about rules and norms, and did Michael Wolff, of course, the author of the now famous book that everyone will apparently read about Trump, what did he do? Did he break the rules and norms of journalism? I'm actually not sure what they're talking about when they say that. I think there's some. There seems to be some implication that he is using what was deemed off the record. And I don't know how other reporters could know exactly what arrangements Wolf had with anybody, whether he had agreed to off the record. And of course, as opposed to what the late Tim Russert did, the rule is, the default is it's on the record unless it's called off the record. And if Wolf let the guy think it was off the record but never agreed to it, well, that's I'm not sure what the rule that's broken there. But be that as it may, the approach that Wolf has taken and why his book and the pre-coverage of the book is so effective is because the Maggie Haberman and Michael Shear, all these New York Times reporters, well, he's just reporting stuff we already have said. And I said, think about that. If you think that's true, how come the reaction to the book is different than the reaction to your stories?
Yeah.
It's the presentation. It's the frame. It's the willingness to say, look, taking all these facts, we can now conclude that Donald Trump is unfit, he's incompetent, he's got dementia, he's ignorant, all the things that you and I say. He just go ahead and takes the next step and takes the conclusion, as opposed to using words like reinvention, authenticity, transformation of the presidency, all these nonsense words that frankly hide the story you've just told. If I have 5 facts and I write 100 paragraphs of these 5 damning facts, and I just sprinkle them around while telling us sort of this, soft focus, he's reinventing things, as opposed to saying, look at these 5 things that are just outrageous and should call for his removal from office.
Yeah.
I've reported the same 5 facts, but what did I do to them? I buried them. I justified them. I rationalized them. I normalized them.
Yep.
Yeah, that's what the New York Times has been doing. Now, the thing that I did want to talk to you about, I know we're probably close to the
we have a break coming.
To the break.
2 minutes.
I think that there's one story. There are policy issues that matter a lot. Obviously, chip renewal, DACA, all these things that, what the CR is going to be. Is it going to be a government shut? Those things are important and have to be covered. But the existential, the momentous story, in my view, the one that matters in 2018 more than any, besides the election itself, is what's Robert Mueller up to? What is he doing? And the fact that no one really knows is something I want to talk to you about after the break, and consider what that means and how it might or might not impact the 2018 election as well. So it becomes to me an interesting question. I have not noticed reporters talking or even addressing the fact that they have no real access to the Mueller investigation. I'll leave the listeners with one thought process. And I'll say 2 words: George Papadopoulos.
Okay.
George Papadopoulos, mentioned in the context of the Mueller investigation, first became apparent when? The day his indictment was unsealed. That is, he had been indicted for a month and nobody knew.
Yeah. Right. That's
he didn't
true.
come up in a single story.
Right. No, well, very little. Certainly nothing that hinted, oh, yeah, he'll be the first indictment out of the box. Or
that he's flipped or anything like that. This is an important point because we know much less than people let on. And Schmidt's story goes into this, and it's the weakest part of the story. And it's the weakest part of the story because he doesn't know. So he sort of asks administration officials what they think Mueller's up to. And then he goes to legal experts who say, well, based on what's available publicly, we don't think it's enough yet to say that there's an obstruction of justice by Donald Trump. But available publicly is the key. You don't know what's available publicly. We didn't know much of anything.
Yeah, I mean, it was he did a remarkable job in keeping the lid on things. We have we still have about 15 seconds before we got to go here, but yeah, that's been the distinguishing feature, I think. You're right, of the Mueller investigation is he has kept the lid on. I imagine from day one he told everybody, listen, you know how sensitive this is, and you know how easily this can blow up on political grounds. You got to stay quiet, and they did. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show on Netroots Radio. We've had further discussion about directions we can take during the break. So, Armando, well, let's see, you filled me in on a couple of the details of this Schmidt story. By the way, Schmidt, of course, I guess just having come off of that round of criticism for having conducted the interview and, fallen short of how most people imagine they would have conducted the interview, let's say, of Donald Trump that he happened to get. I mean, I think he knew he was supposed to get it by going to lunch with Chris Ruddy. But I guess mindful of that criticism, bounces back here with a story well put together. But reading between the lines tells us even more, I guess, than just reading the story itself, though I'm definitely going to have to pour through it because you had some other interesting details there.
Worth your time. It's worth your time. It's the depravity and corruption of the Trump White House is pretty manifest there, and it's increasing takeover of the Justice Department is basically demonstrated by a story that has been a little overshadowed by the Wolf Book, but our old friend John Solomon. So who knows if it's true? But John Solomon, people may not know, is a right-wing hack who used to be at the AP and now is at the Hill. And frankly, his stories are not reliable generally. But he reports that out of the Arkansas U.S. Attorney's Office, where there's a Huckabee crony as acting U.S. Attorney, they've opened an investigation into the Clinton Foundation.
Yes.
And pay for play.
Super important.
Now, 2 days ago, the president, or 2 or 3 days ago, the president tweeted out that this must happen, and lo and behold, it just did.
Well, he has the absolute right to do what he wants with the Justice Department, he said. Everyone told him he was wrong, so he began doing it.
Yeah, apparently it's not so wrong.
No, he's not. I really have to. Everything about the way the Trump administration runs, you basically have to ask yourself, when you say that can't be done or you're not allowed to do that, you have to ask, what physically stands in the way of doing this? Because if I order it and you can't tell me they killed me, then you're fired if you don't do it. So that's the measure for
there's no rails, there's no norms, there's nothing will stop Trump unless somebody's stopping him. Mm-hmm. And that's to go back to the New York Times story, where I think that one of the biggest missing holes, and it's frankly to the credit, and that's the way it should be. That's what James Comey and the FBI should have been doing during the election, not talking about the investigation. And if they have something to say, it should be said in an indictment.
Yeah.
Or not at all.
Make it count,
And Bob Mueller's team has spoken through indictments. The long indictment of Manafort and Gates, the short indictment of Michael Flynn, and the more narrative indictment of George Papadopoulos. So what we know of what they've done is contained there. Now, we always get report from people who get interviewed and ask for documents, and they are not under any confidentiality. A grand jury witness isn't either. They can walk out and say what they talked about if they want. Generally they don't, for obvious reasons, unless they're Carter Page, who apparently can't help but talk about what he was asked about. But everybody else keeps quiet. So when you read this Mike Schmidt story and the reporting on the shenanigans in the White House is strong, well sourced, well presented. But then he goes to what's Mueller looking at, and he listens to administration officials sort of speculating about what Mueller's about, and then he goes to outside legal experts about what would Mueller need, and talk about what's publicly available. Of course, and that goes to my central point here is going by what's, quote, publicly available, unquote, when it comes to Mueller is a mistake because we know that he doesn't make things publicly available. And the proof was, I think, the best proof was when the Papadopoulos indictment was unsealed a month after it had occurred. Nobody had a clue that this was happening. It was completely a surprise. Yeah. And I just think that that's the issue with the biggest story of 2018 outside the election. And it's problematic in that sense, as I was saying beforehand, that we may not get a full picture of where Mueller's at before the election, and the question of whether that is fair to the voter or not to me seems a good one. Mueller will do what he's supposed to do, which is not talk about it. And the guidelines from the Justice Department and the FBI is to actually clamp up even more, or not even start investigations close to an election. Mm-hmm. Because you want to not have the justice, the wheels of justice unduly prejudice the electoral process. And I think that's a good rule. It's the rule that James Comey utterly ignored, ironically, as well argued by Rod Rosenstein in his memo to Donald Trump as to a justification for why Comey should have been fired. And I'll be the first on the record. James Comey did deserve to be fired for what he did in 2016. But the story that Schmidt tells on that is fascinating in that obviously Trump wanted to fire Comey the whole time after he wouldn't come out. And the Schmidt's reporting is believable in the sense that the straw that broke the camel's back for Trump was Comey's congressional testimony. When he confirmed he was investigating the Russia interference, but would not speak to the fact of whether Trump was being investigated or not. Mm-hmm. Remember, Trump, for some reason, thought that was hugely important.
Right.
He asked them 3 times. He called them all the time. Now, am I being investigated? Which, breaks every protocol anyway. Right. And Comey, frankly, blew it again by answering him. It says, Mr. President, that's not a question I'm supposed to be answering. If you get a target letter, that's when you'll know. Otherwise, you don't get to know any more than anybody else knows if they're being investigated.
Yeah.
That's equality of treatment. But when that happened, Trump was decided, and he told Sessions, and Sessions started asking people to put negative stories in the paper about Comey. It's an unbelievable story.
Yeah, I see
the corruption.
It's excerpted here. I guess getting to this point is another great way of not necessarily reading the articles. There are some good, reliable sources for excerpting. Tegan Goddard, one of them, and has this short piece here. Trump demanded that Sessions protect him. This is excerpted from the same article. President Trump gave firm instructions in March to the White House's top lawyer, stopped the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, from recusing himself in the Justice Department's investigation, for one thing. Public pressure also building for Mr. Sessions, who had been a senior member of the Trump campaign, to step aside, but the White House counsel, McGahn, carried out the president's orders. McGahn was unsuccessful, and the president erupted in anger in front of numerous White House officials, saying he needed his attorney general to protect him.
Where's my Roy Cohn?
Yes.
Is the pull quote.
That's it. Mr. Trump then asked, where's my Roy Cohn? Where's the guy that breaks all the rules and is, generally considered the most egregiously unethical lawyer of all time? Where is one of those? There's also this poll here. The New York Times has also learned that 4 days before Mr. Comey was fired, one of Mr. Sessions' aides asked a congressional staff member whether he had damaging information about Mr. Comey. part of an apparent effort to undermine the FBI director. So you got to need dirt. Once again, if it's what you say it is, I love it. Fishing for dirt about another political opponent so that they can plant it. That, by the way, all by itself confirms the entirety of the Trump-Russia investigation. This is how we operate. It's the Roy Cohn style. Where's my Roy Cohn? Your Roy Cohn is dead, for one thing, by the way. He died of AIDS, and a story over the weekend about how you were so disgusted by that you cut off all contact with him, though you considered him a close personal friend, and refused to visit him in the hospital because, oh my God, AIDS. And in the 80s, everybody was panicked about it, but no one more so than Donald Trump because he was trying to sex down anything that moved. But anyway, that's another story to grow out of the Wolf book, by the way.
The friend's wife story, of course,
yes.
in the book is unbelievable.
That one, unbelievable, except it's, of course, totally believable.
It's completely
yeah.
It's unbelievable this man is president.
Right.
Is always the refrain.
Yes.
But you can see, and Schmidt's story on this is just, and I think that if you do read the original article, it is told properly. It's presented better. Properly. It's what the New York Times has not been doing. Mm-hmm. So I do give kudos to the story, but I do think, again, the weak part comes when they start. It just devolves into speculation about what Mueller's up to, and that shouldn't have been in the story simply because he hasn't reported it out because he can't, because he doesn't have any sources in Mueller's team who's leaking. And again, credit to Mueller, but the reporter has to know what the story he has and just report that. I thought a better editor would have cut that part out.
Yeah.
But it just rang bells in me because it's the Republicans in the Congress are obvious. Paul Ryan is completely compromised at this point. He was always terrible and horrible. I didn't realize he would, basically engage in a cover-up. His support of Devin Nunes on the House Intelligence Committee makes this, he's unfathomable. And whoever argued that he had any honor at all is just completely embarrassed because he doesn't. So it's not going to come from the Republican or congressional investigations. I'm sorry, Adam Schiff, that's not going to happen. Maybe if we win the Congress back and you run the committee, yes, everything can change. But for now, this year, that all you're going to get is stonewalled by them. And I don't trust Richard Burr either. And certainly I don't trust Chuck Grassley. So to expect much out of the Republican Congress at this stage is not realistic. What might be realistic is a huge indictment in July or August by Mueller. But is it realistic that he would indict in July or August? Because the guidelines and protocols would argue that he shouldn't indict. He should wait till after November,
right,
to do any major political earth-shaking indictment. Let's say Jared Kushner or Donald Trump Jr.
Yeah, I mean, in all likelihood, yes. Although, who knows whether they just believe they're in unique circumstances here. That we won't know. That certainly won't be leaking anytime soon either. And again, the indictments will do the talking there. If they happen prior to an election, then you know that they think they're working outside of the box and the normal rules don't apply and it just can't wait.
I would think June, July at the latest could be. After that, I believe Mueller's going to play it by the book and not do anything until after the election. And I would applaud him for doing that.
Yeah.
Whether I like it or not, when it works in my side's favor or not, but Comey deciding he, of all people, was the person who could just violate the rules and do what he did, is problematic. It was wrong, and I hope Mueller doesn't. But I think if he has a big political dynamite indictment, and I don't mean he's not going to indict Trump this year, or even issue a report as to why he should be impeached this year. The other thing to keep in mind is the Paul Manafort trial is scheduled for May.
Okay.
That would be Manafort and Gates and unless there's an agreement to delay the trial, it's going to go forward.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's something to look for. And,
right. So the story of what Mueller can do this year, I think, is important, and I think it's a story that, frankly, is impossible to tell right now, for the reasons I've just discussed. And I just think that all this stuff in this great Mike Schmidt report, and the fact that Sessions is a corrupt scumbag, and everything else, and Rod Rosenstein, who's a very interesting character, who's I don't know what he's about exactly, though I think he's trying to defend the integrity of the Justice Department, believe it or not. I mean, he named Mueller for special counsel when I'm fairly sure Trump was shocked to have that happen.
Yeah, probably.
But frankly, by firing Comey, it became inevitable, but Trump didn't see it that way. But Rosenstein stood up and did that.
Yeah.
The question becomes, and it's raised by Jack Goldsmith in a Lawfare story this morning, is why hasn't Rosenstein recused himself? He's clearly a witness on the obstruction case. And the argument is the alternative that, well, Trump's not being investigated for obstruction, which I'm very doubtful if that's the case. Or he has recused himself on just the obstruction part, which is possible, and hasn't publicly announced it, which I don't know that he would have to or should. But the fact is that there is a good argument for him to be away from it. Now, I think there's another point that's missed by Goldsmith is Sessions has not recused himself in the sense that he knows what's going on. Theoretically, he says he gets reports on it. He said he would do it the way Loretta Lynch did the Clinton email story, which is wrong in that Loretta Lynch wasn't implicated as a possible target or witness of the Clinton email story, whereas Sessions was a member of the Trump campaign and met with Kislyak, and in fact, he perjured himself to Congress about these things. But that's it's just not the same thing. But the point I'm trying to make is that Rosenstein, when you oversee a special counsel, you don't really oversee them. They have full independence.
Yeah.
It's not like Rosenstein can tell them what to do. But in theory, he could be informed. It's probably a bad idea if he is. But then again, Rosenstein is, he's swimming in the ocean he's in. I actually think that Rosenstein's trying to do as best he can the right thing to preserve the Justice Department. But it could be he's just doing Trump's bidding, and he's going to, wait for the right moment to finish this Mueller thing in a way. But I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think it's worth watching what comes out of Mueller in the next, I would say, 3 to 4 months to see if there's any other major indictments that come out. Because I do think the second half of the year, it's not likely that he will have much activity that becomes public.
Yeah. Well, a good warning for those of us who are pinning so much to the investigation, but a realistic one. So watch out for that. And again, we'll have our eyes open. I don't think no one's going to turn away from Mueller in the next couple of months. So
that's for sure.
All right.
And it'll be interesting to see if he ever starts leaking. I don't think he will.
I doubt
But if he does, it'll be interesting to try to figure out why. Anyway, let me hand you back your last 10 minutes so you can wrap up your week properly.
Sure.
Thanks for letting me sort of talk about this Mueller-Schmidt story.
Yeah,
because I think it's important.
I agree. Thanks very much, Armando. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Stay warm if you can. I think that was a rather important bit. Definitely reading in between the lines. Obviously, that's what we like to be able to do with these items on the show. And I think that's a great point. And Mueller likely, like I said, has had a lid on his investigators and the leaks situation since day one, because it's so easy with such a highly sensitive and highly political subject. Any wrong move would be magnified 1,000 times by this spin machine. They're already attempting to do this. You're seeing the same playbook being used against something that isn't an official investigation. The Wolf Book, in real time, you're watching them undermine. The first day of reactions to excerpts from the book has largely been from from the journalistic perspective, and particularly for the pro-Trump or even the people who are pro-neutrality, which, isn't even really a position to be taking with this. It's ridiculous to take it with this particular administration, or maybe any administration for that matter. But the pushback on Wolf, like, there's no way he could have known this or that other thing. I mean, right now the official line, such as it is, if you in this administration, if you consider the president's personal words to be the official line of this administration, I don't know, maybe that's not even true. And that's how bad, that's the situation we find ourselves in. But if you take his words to be the official line of the administration, he did anger tweet yesterday. I authorized zero, capital Z, zero access to the White House. Actually turned him down many times for author of phony book. I never spoke to him for book full of lies, misrepresentations, and sources that don't exist. Look at this guy's past and watch what happens to him and Sloppy Steve. Now he's angry with Steve Bannon. Sloppy Steve. Can you believe that? Well, another childish nickname for something. But anyway, I authorized zero access. I don't know whether you remember authorizing or whether you did authorize or you just had somebody else do the authorization. It's hard to tell with this idiot president. But yeah, as others have pointed out, in fairness, as Arch Pundit said, right, this guy has no idea what he did yesterday. He has no idea whether he's lying about I authorized zero access or not. Meanwhile, dozens of reporters since have said, yeah, one of the weird things is I visited the White House X number of times. I was there every day. I saw Michael Wolff walking in all the time, and he was walking around not with a journalist, press pass badge, but an appointment badge. And I saw him I saw him exactly where he said he was, sitting on a couch in the West Wing, just listening to conversations dozens of times. There was another one that a weird Twitter conversation that I put aside yesterday from Janice Min, who's, what is she? She's the, is she founder of, or part owner, of the Hollywood Reporter, which is, of course, the source of so much of this stuff from yesterday. And there were complaints from other writers out there basically saying things like, there's this passage in the book where it's a 500-word dialogue between Roger Ailes and Steve Bannon that's being recounted and offered up as a direct quote, as a verbatim transcript of the conversation that took place at a dinner party for 6 people, a very exclusive dinner party in New York. How is it possible, one, that he remembers every word that was said? That's clearly not the case. And so, now we can question everything. Everything that's offered up as a quote is questionable. And 2, how does Michael Wolff know what Steve Bannon said to Roger Ailes at a private dinner party for 6? Well, there are several answers to that, not the least astonishing of which was, well, where was the dinner? Oh, it was at Michael Wolff's house. He hosted the dinner. He invited Bannon and Ailes, and the conversation took place right in front of him. And who knows whether he was recording it or not, but I mean, that's a pretty smack in the face kind of an answer. Oh yeah, well, look at this. He's full of it. I mean, look, how could this guy possibly know what happened at a dinner party with these guys? He hosted the dinner party? Oh, well, that'll shut you down. Plus, of course, Janice Min, and by the way, I was one of the 6 guests at the Bannon-Ailes dinner party in January of 2017, and every word I've seen from the book about it is absolutely accurate. It was an astonishing night. Well, that is pretty astonishing, and that ought to end the conversation there, too. But there were several such conversations going on, by the way, including other challenges to the veracities of the stories, of other people confirming this went down just as explained, or Wolff was exactly where he said he was. So I don't know what you're talking about. There's been a lot of it, and I'll see if we can't dig up some more examples. We'll probably discuss it. Probably still be discussing this as Trump spends the weekend anger tweeting about it. Lots of more stories about the split from Steve Bannon, too. Lots of entries in that category. Washington Post writing one, Crooked.com, Brian Beutler writing lots more about it. We don't need Steve Bannon to tell us what we already knew about Donald Trump. Washington Post's headline, we already knew the alarming truth about Trump. Wolff's book just confirms it. And a Politico entry from, let's see, from, if I remember correctly, was it Bill Scher who wrote, yes, entitled, Steve Bannon Was Never That Smart. Now, obviously, I'm going to agree with that take, but that part of a second line of reactions to the story of separations from Bannon, not just the Mercers, but of course, apparently the Breitbart comment section was rife with Bannon criticism yesterday, and allegedly, I saw at least tweeted yesterday, I don't know whether anyone would bother to follow up on it, so the Breitbart board was meeting, discussing whether or not to fire Bannon. So if the Mercers are cutting off his personal security detail, Breitbart might end up firing him. Now, the last piece of the puzzle is, will that weirdo Egyptian politician kick him out of the Breitbart embassy townhouse that he crashes in when he's in Washington? Also, even have seen some great interactions on Twitter of people hating on Bannon and insisting that he was a moron, only to be revealed to have recently deleted their posts declaring Steve Bannon a genius for all time. So that was a pretty interesting shakeout of the whole situation as well. Let's see. Lastly, I should at least update you on the fact that the Huffington Post has found the neo-Nazi Twitter account of the young teenager who recently committed the double homicide here in Northern Virginia, killing his girlfriend's parents and then shooting himself, ending up in the hospital, not yet dead. But he was tweeting pseudonymously on Twitter and working on Facebook, and apparently they've identified the accounts he's used and, of course, the real name of the perpetrator as well. I assume that by this time Monday, we'll have photos of him at the Charlottesville rally, and he will turn out to have been everything that they said he was, which is, of course, a horrible situation. And, wow, so much more that really needs discussion, but we're just not going to get to before the weekend, but maybe we can digest over the weekend and come roaring back on Monday with another show featuring all of this fun stuff. One other, let's see, I guess I can't even bother launching into this thing, but also found on Twitter a very nice tweet storm explication of the emoluments problems that Armando and I are discussing all the time, and some growing awareness journalistically that there really is a storyline to be mined there. It's amazing that people don't know this for some reason, or why people have overlooked it, but the whole world is on fire. And, of course, the domestic scene is aflame with the self-immolation of counterpuncher extraordinaire Donald Trump. How do you like that? I guess we'll wrap things up then by, in addition to telling you what's coming up next on Netroots Radio, just reminding you as we go into the weekend of the story of the weekend, how you should be spending your weekend, and maybe how I should be spending my weekend. Reading this new Michael Wolff book, which will apparently be available. Apparently, though I did see some tweet reports that there are no people in line at the bookstore waiting for the book, because the book, I guess, isn't actually there yet. But downtown at the big bookstores, and at Kramer Books in particular, there are reporters lined up waiting for people to line up for the book. They're missing out on the story. Anyway, yeah, so they pushed the publication date up. Great counterpunch, Donald. Now everybody has the weekend to read it and digest it, and it'll be the topic of the Sunday shows. What a counterpuncher that guy is. Anyway, what's coming up next? It is the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy for Friday. Let me get right to it so we can squeeze some more stories in. Starting off in the Bistro Cafe, the funding for Trump's border wall will cover 70 miles of a photo op that could prevent the government remaining open in an election year. Really? Then on the rest of the menu, the Trump administration just announced a delay to an Obama-era rule, yet another one, that combated housing segregation. Not a personal interest for Donald Trump at all, right? Jeff Sessions tried to obtain compromising information on James Comey in the days before his firing, and Donald Trump is finally forced to hand over his business documents to special counsel Robert Mueller. So he's onto him after all. Excellent. More after this.
From Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show.
with David Waldman.
Here's one I heard about. Let's see. Apple issuing a fix for iPhones, iPads, and Macs after a major chip maker disclosed flaws that may leave nearly every modern computing device vulnerable to hackers. And the oceans of liquid ethane and methane on Saturn's largest moon, Titan, are much like the water oceans on our own planet.